Dawn came as a thin gray wash over the rye fields of East Prussia, the telegraph wires a black staff line across the sky. A German signalman on a siding near Deutsch Eylau wiped dew from his handset and listened to the rattle of trains braking hard. Flat cars rolled past loaded with field kitchens and stacks of ammunition. Wagons clanged down ramps, horses tossing their heads at the smell of coal and hot iron. Officers stood with maps pinned to the sides of cattle cars, sketching with gloved fingers, counting miles by the space between their knuckles. It was August 26, 1914, and the Eighth Army, outnumbered and newly commanded, was shuffling whole corps by rail as if the front were a chessboard that could be picked up and set down again while the game was still being played. A week earlier, the same army had fallen back after a stinging defeat at Gumbinnen. Its first commander had talked of retreating behind the Vistula. Berlin sent new men instead. Paul von Hindenburg, recalled from retirement, looked like a portrait stepped down from a frame. Erich Ludendorff arrived with the confidence of Liège behind him. Between them stood a staff officer whose thin smile betrayed how much he had already guessed about the enemy's carelessness. Russian radio operators filled the air with orders in the clear. Intercept stations scrawled their phrases on paper, and charts at headquarters grew fat with pencil marks showing two Russian armies advancing apart. General Rennenkampf's First Army pushing west from the northeast, and General Samsonov's Second Army driving north from the border through woods and lakes toward the rail lines that fed this corner of Germany. The country looked harmless if you did not know it. Low ridges, bright water in narrow lakes, birch woods that hid a regiment easily and swallowed sound. Roads turned to powder under August heat. Dust hung in the hedgerows so thick it stitched units together with a visible thread. German farmers watched columns pass with a mix of fear and relief. Some loaded wagons and moved out. Others stayed and brought buckets to the pumps when thirsty men asked. Church bells kept their hours, as if the old time mattered. But the same bells carried sound farther than they should, and horses started at what was not there. The plan that formed at 8th Army headquarters fit the map the intercepts had drawn. Hold Rennenkampf with a screen to the northeast. Turn the rest of the army south and cut into Samsonov before the two Russian forces could touch hands. Move by rail at night, march by day. Make speed count more than mass. Corps commanders read the orders and bothered the messengers with the same question. Where exactly was the other Russian army? The answers remained numbers on paper and arrows moved by fingertips. It would have to be enough. On the 26th, German columns angled south and east toward the towns men could name from their school atlases. I Corps under General von François reached the line near Oostdau, where road dust and refugees had already stripped the fields of quiet. 20 Corps to the east dug in around the lakes near Ortelsburg. I Reserve Corps and forces under General von Below filled the spaces between. The Russians came on hungry and confident. They had crossed into German land with almost 150,000 men and a promise of supplies that the roads could not keep. Their staff officers rode with telephones in carriages that could not always find wire. Their battalions stepped off with rifles that fired reliably and boots that did not. Their orders told them to press, press, press. Contact sparked along a wide arc. Skirmish lines stumbled into one another in pine shade. Machine guns found their tripods and changed the sound of the day. Near Oostdau, François looked at the ground, measured the wind with his cheek, and decided not to wait. He pushed forward against orders and struck the Russian left hard. His gunners bracketed the roads and made them into lanes of iron. A regiment of the Second Army, already stretched out from days of marching, tried to form and could not. Prisoners went to the rear with dust-caked faces and a look that did not change when someone shouted questions in German they did not speak. Farther east, the Russians shoved the Germans backward at first, bullets shearing leaves into green confetti over trenches that had been shallow ditches an hour before. Then the line stiffened where the lakes and marsh narrowed the ground, and the fire settled into a grind that felt like the hand of the day pressing on your back. The 27th brought heat and the smell of spilled oats and blood. German trains had done their work. Units that had been near Königsberg 2 nights earlier appeared south, as if the army had grown a new limb. Ludendorff's orders moved pieces in a crescent around Samsonov's flanks, while 20 corps held him in the middle. To the west, Francois kept driving. To the east, Below's men closed the door slowly enough not to be seen, quickly enough not to be stopped. Samsonov's maps, heavy with sketch lines and hopeful distances, did not match the ground anymore. His corps commanders reported ammunition short and roads clogged. The wireless crackled with calls for Rennenkampf to fall on the Germans' rear, each message sent because the previous had brought no reply. Between the two Russian armies lay days of marching and a repairing of command that would not happen in time. On the 28th, the trap began to feel like one. Russian units that had pushed toward the rail town of Allenstein turned to find Germans where their maps promised only roads. Some fought like men who understood the cost of delay and paid it. Others broke into fragments when the fire reached a pitch that emptied thought. Near Neidenberg, shouting rose and fell like a bad song while the German infantry pushed bayonets over shattered fences and into gardens where late beans still climbed their sticks. Along a birch-lined lane, a battery unlimbered and fired until counter-battery shells found it. The gunners lay down in their own wheel ruts because that was the only flat place left. A priest traveling with the Russians blessed a string of wounded under trees that kept dropping bark dust in their hair. By the 29th, Francois had cut across the Russian left and then bent in, chewing the flank into a ragged curl. To the east, Below's corps came up like a gate swinging shut. In the middle, XX Corps and elements rushed south by rail slammed straight into the Russian center. Orders in Samsonov's headquarters grew shorter, then longer, and finally lost their endings. His staff tore map sheets into squares to make notes that could be sent to corps that no longer occupied the spots their numbers claimed. He rode forward with a small escort, dust chalking his boots, and tried to pull units into a new line that would not hold. Men came to him with reports of regiments that were no longer regiments, companies missing, battalions scattered into woods. Some simply said there was no ammunition left. In places, the fight turned into a circle, Russians firing outward from hedgerows until the last clips were gone, then dropping their rifles and lifting their hands. Late on the 30th, with night already gathering under the trees, Samsonov rode toward Willenberg with 2 officers, and a sense that the map of his army had collapsed into nothing he could use. He had seen the prisoners going back and the gaps where his own units should have been. The guns to the west sounded farther away, not because the battle was ending, but because the ring had tightened and shoved the noise outward. He left the road and moved into a stand of trees. When his horse stumbled, he dismounted. The officers with him waited in that strained silence men use when they know what is coming and cannot shape it. A single shot carried weakly in the trees. They found the body by feel. They covered it with a cloak, and then with branches, because that was what they had. The next day the counting began. The number the Germans wrote into their reports measured triumph in prisoners. Tens of thousands taken in columns that stretched beyond the horizon, rifles stacked in cones that looked like rows of narrow, dead trees. Others counted the cost in other units of measure: boots piled in wagons, tags taken from the dead, horses that stood with their heads low and would not be led. German losses were real, but smaller. The field hospitals filled and emptied, and ambulances went back for more. The 8th Army, which had seemed cornered a week earlier, stood intact. East Prussia, whose barns and stoops still smelled of fear, took in men whose names were suddenly on every tongue. Hindenburg and Ludendorff received the crowd's praise, though the staff officer with the thin smile and the maps went back to his desk and drew more arrows. Rennenkampf's First Army, too far and too slow, fought days later along the lakes and was pushed back, its defeat folded into the first one in the way that history's like clean edges. The word chosen for the victory was not the name of the largest town nearby, but an older one, Tannenberg, a deliberate reach back to a medieval field where Germans had once lost to Slavs, now rebranded as payback, written in the modern alphabet of wire and steam and gunpowder. Newspapers made poetry of it where none had been spoken on the ground. Villagers in the path of the second battle read the headlines and nailed shutters anyway. What had happened in that week was not magic. It was radios used like open windows. It was railroads doing what they were built to do. It was a commander who pressed at one flank without waiting for permission, and another who closed the other flank before the enemy knew the door was being built. It was a staff that guessed right about how two hostile armies, led by men with old grudges and new responsibilities, would fail to find one another in time. And it was the simple, unsparing arithmetic of men walking into fire and then not walking anymore. In the farmyards where the wreckage had been stacked, children found cartridge cases in the dust the next spring and made necklaces of them until mothers took them away. The lakes went back to reflecting clouds. Birch bark shed in curling strips that looked like spent paper. Soldiers on both sides told themselves they had seen the worst. They had not. But for a week in late August, on a ground of sand, water, and rail, an army ceased to exist as an army. Its survivors fled east, its dead lay in trenches carved at speed, and its commander did not ride home. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.